Today, the Gospel presents us with Jesus calling his first disciples on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He called Simon and Andrew, James and John, unimportant men from an unimportant village in an unimportant part of Israel. While we may scratch our heads at Jesus' choice of his followers, I do think the more amazing thing is that Peter, Andrew, James, and John said yes. And they didn't just say yes, they acted on it. They left their nets still unfinished in their boats and followed him. James and John even left their father Zebedee literally standing in the boat. We read this passage year after year, and I think we forget just how amazing it is. The immediacy of their response, the firmness of their decision, and the willingness to leave everything behind. Not all people were able to respond this way. Later in the Gospel, Jesus asks another group to follow him. But one replies, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." And Jesus says to him, "Let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God." After that, another person comes to Jesus and says, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family." Jesus replies, "No one who puts their hands to the plow and looks back is fit for the service in the kingdom of God." This second group of callings remind us that not all are able to say yes to Jesus like the disciples did. There are so many things that they still want to do, even good things, like simply saying goodbye to their family. And now saying goodbye to your family is actually an example that's dear to my own heart, because I remember that when I was in university and first started thinking of the priesthood, I visited a seminary, and I remember being in the chapel there and asking God for really the very first time in a serious way, "God, do you want me to be a priest?" And in the chapel there, I felt God's presence very strongly, but it was as if he was sitting in front of me and saying, "I'm not going to speak to you right now. Just silence." Not knowing how to interpret this, I went to one of the priests at the seminary and I said, "What does this mean? I asked God if he wanted me to be a priest. I gave him an open heart, and all he gave me was silence." But it was a profound silence, like a silence where you could tell he was present. And that's when the priest said, "Well, I don't know exactly for sure, but let me ask you this. If God spoke to you and said, 'Right now, what I want you to do is to call home and to tell them that you're not coming home, because what God has called you to do is to stay at this seminary, study for 8 years to become a priest, will then ship you off to the missions, and maybe you'll come home to visit your family at your 25th anniversary.' If that were what God asked you in that chapel, what would your response be?" I said, "Well, I'd probably say, 'God, let me think about it,' and then I wouldn't pray anymore. I would have avoided the question. At the end of the day, I would have been like that person in the gospel who, as beautiful as it is, going home to wanting to say goodbye to your family, that's not what God is calling you to do right now. And I would have said no." And he said, "Well, that makes sense." He says, "The reason is probably because you don't trust that whatever God says to you, whatever comes out of his mouth, whatever he asks you to do, his calling, is in fact the very best thing for your life. And this is what he made you for. You need to trust that. You need to believe that. And only when you do will God open his mouth and speak to tell you what his plan for your life is, what your calling is. At the end of the day, I didn't really trust that God's answer was going to be the best for me. What I wanted was God's plan, but also a bit of my own, because I didn't think it was good enough. And God's calling doesn't really work that way. Now contrast that with Peter, Andrew, James, and John. When Jesus invited them to drop everything to follow him, they didn't question it. They didn't want to add their own spin on it and say, well, God, Jesus, I like the idea, but let me also do this too. I think you forgot about it. They simply received the invitation as a gift and gave their whole lives to that mission until the very end. God has a plan for everyone's life. God has a calling for you. The question is, do we believe that this calling, this mission, this invitation to follow him is the best thing for our life? Do we accept this mission wholeheartedly, pushing away all the distractions in life that hinder us, all the ideas about what we think will make our life great, in order to accept this mission and push on in it, knowing that this will bring us the greatest fulfillment in life? Peter, Andrew, James, and John answered yes to the call of Jesus that day on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. They were filled with joy, for they had now found their mission, their purpose, their meaning in life. May we hunger like them for our mission, so that when Jesus does call us, we can leave everything behind and follow him.